Again, today's story title is Escargo de la Mort, and like all stories, we start from the blank page, and we'll see what we can make of this. Simon was tired of running. He was more tired of waiting. Let's say the waiting. Always waiting. He did not remember what started this. Not clearly. When he was a kid, maybe, how old should we make this kid? Let's make him 12. Maybe 12. He had stepped on one. Clearly, the one he had killed meant something to the one that hunted him all his life. He remembered they were big. Bigger than any he had seen. Oh, keep going. But they were still snails. Slugs with shells on their backs. They were spotted, striped, slimy things. The shell had crunched. The body had split open and oozed. Say oozed out its life. Then Simon had, let me make this the new paragraph here, I think. Then Simon had collapsed. He couldn't have passed out entirely, even for a moment. Because if he had, he'd have died right there and then. Okay. Maybe that would have been better. But seeing how his mother went, he doubted it. He doubted it very much, let's say. He had felt sick. The entire world spun. And at the time, let me put a comma in two places. And at the time, he swore it was remorse for killing an innocent creature under his shoe just because he could. Maybe all kids were cruel killers at their core until they learned better, or at least controlled their more primal urges. Now he thought the woozy... Okay, let's see if this computer can spell that for me. Nope, I'm not even close. Let's try this. Woozy... There we go, I need a Z. That was what was wrong. Now he thought the woozy feeling had been something chemical. If so, it was a close thing that day, because he had seen what that creature's poison or venom could do. So it could really do. That was the first time he saw, I'll say he noticed, no, he realized the surviving fat and ugly snail was coming for him. Simon had scooted away as his stomach tightened, and he turned to the side to eject his Saturday morning breakfast. Nothing came up, but the snail kept coming. He tried twice to stand and failed, continuing to shuffle away from the slithering thing that continued to adjust its course to go after him. At the time, he thought of those old Looney Tune shorts about the skunk chasing after the cat. Those had long been canceled in more woke times. By the time he turned 15, a year, let's say a couple years, a few years after the death of his mother, by the time he turned 15 and ran away from home. A few years after the death of his mother, he thought more of the the slasher movie monsters that kept catching the teens, no matter how fast they ran. Today, he thought more of YouTube videos of turtles stalking after cats, trying to bite them over and over. Most people found those videos amusing, but none of them had a slow, steady, slithering assassin on their trail their entire lives. Simon got to his feet and staggered home. After a while, he got to feeling better, but a week or so later, the same snail, finally arrived. It had climbed out to the end of a branch outside his bedroom window. Simon, let's say he froze in the midst of getting ready for school and stared at the heavy thing bobbing a few feet from the glass that separated them. He'd thought at the time, there sure are a lot of these things around the city today. Okay. The city lately. But deep down, he always knew it was the same creature that had marked him the day he killed its partner. This was also the first death Simon witnessed at its hands. Now, witnessed from its toxic skin. A bird he could not could not remember what type anymore. I'll say swooped down to make a meal of the thing. Its beak actually sliced a wound into the snail's side near its head, and bobbing appendages. The bird pulled, let's make it a new paragraph. The bird pulled away and lost feathers as it made a choking sound. Let's say Simon didn't know birds could sound like that. Okay, Simon didn't know birds could sound like that. The flying creature changed color, locked up, and fell to the sidewalk like a stone. Simon would pass it several times over the coming days, where the bird's corpse would first turn shock white and then quickly decay into a melting, necrotic black pool. Alright, we'll make it extra gross there. The snail eventually turned from the window to make its way Armand with the scared cat image. The snail eventually turned from the window to make its way back along the branch. Leaves wilted. The slimy trail burned into the discoloring wood, and clear fluid sizzled from the wound that Simon hoped would kill the snail, but no luck. Later, he would see the same thing happen to his hamster once the deadly snail got into his house and his room. That day, he succeeded in tossing the snail out the window. That day he succeeded in tossing the snail out the window without it touching him. Alright. Later he would see that the same thing happened to his hamster once the deadly snail got into his house and his room. That day he succeeded in tossing the snail out the window without it touching him. He flushed the hamster without touching its shriveling body either. The water, let's say the swirling water in the toilet boiled and smoked. The deadly stalker tracked Simon everywhere he went. For the next year. He dodged it at school, in the street, and at home. Obviously, the thing moved slowly, and sometimes he didn't see it for weeks. He tried to kill it more than once with more than one weapon. But it was harder to eliminate than you might think. That dizzy, sick, remorseful feeling that he felt in the park came over him time and time again if he ever got close enough to try. That feeling only got worse the more he was exposed, like some kind of fatal allergy. He tried shooting it from a distance. First with arrows, and later with a gun once he was old enough to buy one. even sighting it blurred his vision now. Simon had tried running over it. The snail grew smarter and more sinister over the years. It traveled along surfaces that did not lend themselves to car wheels. Once he had gotten close, but he blacked out behind the wheel. Let me change these wheels to tires, so I'm not using the word wheel twice. Tires. And here, once he had gotten close, but he blacked out behind the wheel and crunched the front headlight of his new Ford. He'd awoken with his airbag deployed in his face, his nose bleeding, eyes watering. Then he spied the snail pressed into his window and melting the glass under its body. Simon had fled out the passenger side. And staggered half blind down the street. It took him forever to convince authorities he hadn't been drunk at the time of the accident. Alright, let me make this a new paragraph. At the time of the accident, what would they have thought if he'd claimed then that he was being tracked by an assassin snail seeking revenge? They probably would have thought something other than drinking was involved. Okay. All right, let's move this forward. Eventually, it had stopped following him to school and focused on the house. That's when the snail taken his mother. Simon had found her on the ground with the thing on her face. That might have been the closest it had ever come to getting him. He'd reached down to snatch it away from his mother's disfigured features. It was obvious she was gone, but he didn't want that thing eating her away, erasing her face. His fingers stung before he got in grabbing distance. Say his fingers had stung. His fingers had stung before he got in grabbing distance. And he pulled away from reflex rather than any sort of thought. His aversion to the thing's chemicals had saved him more than once. It got to be almost a sixth sense that the creature had caught up with him again. And it was time to move on. The police investigated Simon's dad for a long time. No one could identify the corrosive agent that had killed his mother, that had, let's say, disfigured his mother. They were even more suspicious about the unidentified poisons in her system that were credited as the initial cause of her death. They never arrested him, but the loss of Simon's mother and the constant scrutiny from police and her friends from police, let's say her friends and her family left him hollowed out and broken. As Simon dodged slow death over the years. As Simon dodged slow death over the years, he kept expecting the snail to take his father too. Then they would suspect him. Simon might actually get arrested. He'd be trapped in a cell for the snail to finally have him. But that never happened. Maybe the slow killer had developed its evil genius enough to know that Simon's broken father was breaking him too. By the time he turned 15, Simon started to think the little monster was using his father and the house as bait to keep bringing him back to the same place. That's when Simon fled for good, and his father was too much of a shell of his former self to ever come after Simon. The man died years later while Simon was still on the road and homeless. He hated the cold. He hated being hungry. He hated being hungry, dirty, and sick too. But it was the cold that made him the most miserable. The streets were a dangerous place for a 15-year-old boy. I know I need to hyphenate that, but I'll get to it later. Alright, for a 15-year-old boy. It was a cliche, but it was also true. The greatest danger was always that snail, though. Simon would get a quivering uneasiness, sometimes he'd write it off as nerves or a phantom symptom. But if he waited long enough, the ill feelings got worse, and eventually he saw that thing through watering eyes, slowly creeping toward him again, always coming for him. Simon would bail out and catch some ride to another part of the country. Let's say sometimes he bought himself months, sometimes years, but never forever. It cost him relationships. It cost him having a real life. Eventually, Simon figured out a plan that would really work. Alright. He had nowhere near the wealth to be bi-coastal, but he was anyway. Alright. Say every 6 months for most of his adult life, he moved from the Atlantic to the Pacific and back again. Sometimes, now let's say, at first he stuck with manual labor and cheap apartments. Later, the economy changed enough so that at first he stuck with manual labor and cheap apartments. Later, the economy changed enough so that at first he stuck with manual labor and cheap apartments. Later, the economy changed enough so that he could work freelance from home and live in cheap apartments. 6-month leases typically worked for most places. So life became 6 months in Fireside, Oregon, followed by 6 in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. After that, it was Sonora Beach, California. Followed by, where would he go next? Shoreport, Maryland. He had girlfriends, but never steady, and never married. Usually it was the latter. Usually it was the unwillingness to marry that killed the relationships before fleeing the snail did. Alright. Usually it was the unwillingness to marry that killed the relationships before fleeing the snail did. Let's say if he didn't attach to anyone longer than it took the snail to travel, there was no one for the creature to take from him. Or to use as bait to lure him. One time he stayed in let's say Cheshire Beach, Florida, for 4 straight years. Surprisingly, his relationships down there were even shorter. Okay, let's say shorter lived. He wanted to see if the snail was even still alive. 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days was how long it took to get his answer. Let's say the ill feeling started and he packed up but waited. The last day he nearly couldn't stand but he waited anyway. And the same snail, unchanged by the years. Crawled out between the slats of his rattling air conditioner. Alright, let me fix that. He might have had a chance to kill it then, but the machine was blowing the fumes into his face. But the machine was blowing the fumes into his face. Machine was blowing fumes into his face. He had a severe rash for weeks after he moved just outside of Seattle. All right. Now in his 50s, a man with ulcers, hair loss, now in his 50s, a man with ulcers, hair loss, heart issues, and leathery skin. He was tired of running and more tired of the waiting. He always had been. But he had reached his limit. Alright. Maybe Fran was part of that. She wasn't exactly trying to tie him down, but she'd stuck with him for years now. Most of a decade. He sensed that if he continued to put off a proposal, much longer, that he'd find himself alone again. Much like fleeing the killer all his life, he was tired of loneliness and had grown used to Fran's companionship. Alright. At first, she enjoyed the 6-month per coast lifestyle. I'll need to put commas in there or hyphens in there. I'll do it later. At first, she enjoyed the 6-month per coast lifestyle. They had lived in 5 cities before she got a very good job offer in Tennessee. They had never gone anywhere inland except for short vacations. And he was sure she could see he was on edge the whole time. When she asked him to move with her, he could tell she expected him to decline, and it broke his heart. That resignation on her face brought out all the compartmentalized grief he had been holding onto. He told her yes, and then burst out sobbing. She held him through that fit and actually offered to turn down the job. He said no. He had meant it when he agreed. Let's say that's when the final plan started. Alright. Let's say Simon did most of his freelance work out in a studio built into a barn. The house itself was sealed up tight, but nothing was perfect, and the snail could find its way in, as it had always done. When he was working, he stayed in the barn, waiting for the tingling to come. All right. When she was away, even for a short errand, he went out into the barn and waited. Let's say, hold on just a second, I'm trying to get my thoughts back together. He wanted his scent, his essence, to fill the place. This was where he wanted to face the killer the final time. Then the illness returned. Almost 5 years after the last move. Simon insisted on sleeping out in the barn. He pretended to have a stiff deadline. Let's say, but Fran wasn't stupid. He refused to explain, and she eventually went for an extended visit to her parents' place down in Florida. Parents, let's say retirement place. Let's say he tried his best to not look relieved. He tried his best not look relieved, but she always read him well and left angry. Maybe this was the end of them, but as long as it was not the end of her, he would suffer whatever consequences. The death of his relationship, the end of his life. Then it happened. Let's say Simon prepared as much as he could, but he was still overwhelmed by the crushing sickness and burning. Once they were in the same room again. I hate you, he whispered from a throat on fire with chemical induced inflammation. never meant to. He wasn't sure what the end of that confession might have been. Partly it was because his throat locked up on him, swelling to where he could barely breathe. But mostly it was that he didn't really remember what he meant to do. He had been 12 and had stepped on a snail on purpose. It was a killing step. No matter how much he tried to justify it with how cruel and over the top the killer's persistence for revenge might be. Then it finally entered the studio. It slipped under the door that Simon had built with a gap on purpose. Its slimy trail left a dark burn over the tiles. Its appendages bobbed as if honing in on him, and his eye and Simon's own eyes watered into a blind, stinging blur. He knew it was still inching toward him, though. Choking on the poisons, emanating from the snail's skin, Simon surprised himself as he pushed out one more confession. I'm sorry. With his swelling fingers, he flicked on the lighter and ignited his own slimy trail of flammable liquid along the edges of the room. Let's say the smoke and heat actually cleared his eyes and throat at first. He saw the vengeful snail try to turn, but knew it stood no chance of escaping. Simon attempted to climb up and out the window as he had planned, but his muscles refused to respond. The smoke filled his lungs, and the world the world darkened, let's say. Looks like it looked like the snail finished the job in the end anyway. Simon felt himself going backward. Simon felt himself going backward and figured this was what death felt like. It was like falling. Was that how his mother felt when the snail had poisoned and melted her? Fresh air filled his lungs as he looked up into Fran's face. This further convinced him he had died because Fran was in Florida. But if this was death, why was she calling 911? She had come back for him. He'd discover later. Like his father, and like the car crash, the arson would hold police attention. But since Simon made no insurance claim, there wasn't much they could do beyond harassing him. And how much could they really bother him in comparison to that snail that finally found his slow way to hell, where he belonged. Before all that, before Simon knew he was alive, still for sure, before time would pass, making him think that he might have imagined the snail his entire life. He smiled and accepted Fran's kisses on his smudged and rashy face. He tried twice to clear his throat and then gave up before he drifted off again shortly before help arrived. He whispered into her face, "Will you marry me?" She gave him an answer later that week, but as that snail melted in the heat of chemical fire, she just held him and waited for help.